The Winchester felt cold in her hands, too cold for a night this thick with sweat and fear. Outside, the wind screamed, throwing sand against the cabin like 1,000 tiny claws trying to scratch their way in. But it wasn't the storm that had Maggie Holloway's heart hammering against her ribs. It was the footsteps, heavy boots on the porch, slow, deliberate, each step a drumbeat counting down the seconds of her life. She pressed her back flat against the rough adobe wall, the rifle's barrel locked on the door. In her other arm she held her son, her newborn son, Thomas, a tiny, warm weight against the frantic thumping in her chest. By some miracle he was silent. His dark eyes were wide in the flickering lantern light, staring up at her as if he understood everything. "Shh, little one," she whispered, her lips brushing his soft head. "Mama's here. Mama won't let anyone hurt you." The footsteps stopped. Right outside the door, a shadow fell across the floor, blocking the thin sliver of moonlight that had been her only friend in the dark. Maggie's finger tightened on the trigger. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, the door handle began to turn. "Whoever you are," Maggie called out, her voice steadier than she felt, "I've got a rifle aimed right at your heart." The door creaked open. A man's silhouette filled the frame, tall and broad, blotting out the storm-racked night behind him. Maggie centered the rifle's sights on his chest. One more step, just one more. The world went black. But to understand how she got here, holding a rifle on a stranger with a newborn in her arms, we have to go back. Not far, just a few weeks to a day when the Arizona sun beat down so hard it felt like the sky was a furnace door hanging open. Maggie Holloway was 8 months pregnant, and she moved with the slow, careful rhythm of a woman carrying the future. Her home, Holloway Station, was a lonely speck in a sea of sand and rock, an outpost her husband Robert had built with his own 2 hands. It was meant to be a haven for travelers, a dream they had poured 4 years of their lives into. But Robert was gone now. Fever had taken him 8 months ago, leaving Maggie with nothing but a swollen belly and a silence so deep it felt like its own kind of storm. She hung laundry on the line, the white sheets snapping in the hot wind. Practical tasks were all that kept her from drowning in that silence. They were the anchor that held her to the present, that kept her from drifting away into the past. Inside, she sipped precious water, feeling the baby kick inside her. "I know, little one," she'd murmur, rubbing her stomach. "You're strong, just like your pa." On the mantel sat their only photograph of Robert. His eyes, so warm in life, looked serious and distant in the picture. It was all she had left to show their child. Next to it was a small white wooden cross, the name Emily Rose Holloway carved into the wood. Born and died on the same day 2 years earlier. The memory was a constant ache, a wound that never quite healed. "This is your brother or sister, Emily," Maggie would whisper to the empty air. "I pray God lets me keep this one." Every evening, she did her inventory: food, water, ammunition. Out here, being unprepared wasn't just a mistake, it was a death sentence. The freight wagon only came every 6 weeks. She was on her own, in every sense of the word. Later, she'd open her worn leather Bible, the one her father, a minister back in Missouri, had given her. "God is our refuge and strength," she'd read, her hand resting on her belly, a very present help in trouble. She needed that help now. Lord, she was so alone. Before sleep, she'd write in a small journal, letters to her dead husband. "My dearest Robert, the baby kicks so hard now. I think it must be a boy. I'm afraid, Robert, not just of the birth, though that terrifies me. I'm afraid of failing this child, like I failed our Emily. What if I can't keep this one alive either? I miss you most in the quiet of the night." She closed the book, her hand falling protectively over her child, a silent promise whispered into the darkness. "I won't lose this one, Robert, I promise." But promises were easy to make. Keeping them in a land that took everything was another story entirely. The next morning she was checking the well. Water was life, more precious than gold. Robert had dug it deep, and it had never failed them. As she drew up a bucket, her eyes caught something in the distance. A dark shape, maybe half a mile out. At first she thought it was a dead animal, a common enough sight. But it looked wrong, too angular, too still. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it. A pregnant woman, alone, had no business investigating mysteries in the desert. It was foolish. It was dangerous. It, but another voice, a voice that sounded a lot like Robert's, whispered that you don't turn your back on someone in need. Not ever. Sighing, she went back to the house. She grabbed her wide-brimmed hat and the small revolver Robert had made her learn to use. The gun felt heavy and alien in her apron pocket. She saddled up Patience, her old steady mare, and rode out toward the shape. As she got closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a man. He was lying face down in the sand, one arm stretched out, reaching for nothing. His clothes were fine but torn, caked with dust and what looked like dried blood. Maggie circled him on the horse, the revolver now in her hand. This could be a trap. Raiders were known to use decoys to lure in the unsuspecting. But the desert was empty. No one sprang from behind the dunes. The man didn't move. She dismounted, her swollen belly making the movement awkward. "Sir, can you hear me?" He was alive, barely. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. His skin was burned raw by the sun. There was no horse, no canteen, nothing to explain how he'd gotten here, miles from any known trail. Then she saw it, something glinting in the sand near his outstretched hand. Maggie bent down and brushed the sand away. It was a badge, a lawman's star. It was dented, a deep gouge in the metal, right over the heart. She turned it over. The words were faint, but she could make them out. Nathan Hayes, Sheriff. Redemption Springs. A sheriff. What in God's name was a sheriff doing left for dead in the middle of nowhere? The man groaned, a low, tortured sound. His eyes fluttered, but didn't open. He mumbled something, his lips cracked and bleeding. Maggie knew she had a choice. Leave him to the desert or try the impossible. Getting a man his size back to the station in her condition seemed insane. But she'd learned a long time ago that in the desert, impossible just meant you had to try harder. Getting him back was an ordeal. It took her nearly an hour of grueling work under the relentless sun, using a small shovel to clear a path, to drag him close enough to the horse. He was heavy, a dead weight that fought her every step of the way. "Lord, give me strength," she prayed through gritted teeth. Somehow she wrestled him onto Patience's back, draping him over the saddle like a sack of grain. She tied his hands and feet with rope beneath the horse's belly to keep him from sliding off. It was crude, undignified, but it worked. The walk back to the station was a slow-motion nightmare. Maggie led the horse, her back screaming in protest, the baby kicking as if furious at the exertion. By the time they reached the station, her legs were trembling, and black spots danced in her vision. She managed to get him off the horse and drag him, inch by painful inch, into the guest room. By the time she had him on the bed, she collapsed into a chair, gasping for breath. "It's all right, little one," she whispered, rubbing her belly. "The worst is over." But she knew it wasn't. The real work was just beginning. She gathered her medical supplies, clean cloths, whiskey, needle and thread, and salves she made from her garden herbs. As she cut away his filthy shirt, she saw the roadmap of his life written in scars. Old wounds crisscrossing his torso told stories of 100 different fights. But the new wounds were what worried her. A bullet wound in his shoulder, poorly treated and now red with infection, and a deep gash on his head, just along his hairline. Head injuries were a roll of the dice. They could change a man forever. As she cleaned his wounds with whiskey and water, he began to mutter, lost in a fever dream. "Caroline," he rasped, the name a ghost on his lips. "The children? Get them out." "Shh," Maggie soothed, though she knew he couldn't hear her. "You're safe now." His voice rose, filled with a terrible, frantic urgency. "The church, it's burning. Dear God, I failed them. Pastor Porter, the children." He began to thrash, his body twisting in agony. "God, forgive me," he moaned, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his face. "I wasn't fast enough. I wasn't good enough." The anguish in his voice was so raw, so real, it pierced Maggie's heart. Whoever this man was, Whatever he had done, his suffering was genuine. She placed a cool cloth on his forehead, murmuring quiet words until his thrashing subsided and he fell into a deeper, more natural sleep. She finished bandaging his wounds and placed his dented badge on the small table beside the bed. Nathan Hayes, Sheriff, Redemption Springs. Well, Sheriff Hayes, she whispered to the sleeping man, you've got one hell of a story to tell. That night she slept in the chair beside his bed, her revolver on her lap. She had saved a stranger's life. Now she had to pray her act of mercy hadn't just invited death into her home. For 3 days, Nathan Hayes was a ghost. He drifted in and out of consciousness, lost in a fog of pain and fevered nightmares. Maggie stayed by his side, dripping water between his cracked lips, changing his bandages, listening to his tortured whispers of fire and failure. On the morning of the 4th day, she walked into the room and found him awake. His eyes were clear. The delirium was gone. He watched her, his gaze sharp and alert, as she set down a tray with fresh water and bandages. Where am I? His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. Holloway Station, Maggie replied, keeping a careful distance. I found you in the desert 3 days ago. You were half dead. He tried to sit up, but a sharp wince of pain from his shoulder stopped him. He sank back against the pillows, his eyes taking in the simple room, then settling on her. They flickered down to her pregnant belly, then back to her face. My husband passed, she said, answering the unspoken question. Fever took him 8 months ago. A flash of sympathy crossed his face. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. I'm Nathan Hayes. He paused, a strange look of confusion clouding his features. At least I think I am. The statement hung in the air. What did he mean? He thinks that's his name? Maggie moved to the window, keeping a clear path to the door. Your badge says you're the sheriff of Redemption Springs, she said, nodding toward the star on the bedside table. Looks like it saved your life. He picked up the dented badge, turning it over in his hands as if it were a foreign object. Yes, he said slowly. I remember that much. Sheriff Hayes. His fingers traced the deep gouge in the metal. Someone shot me. Do you remember who? Or why? He closed his eyes, his face tight with concentration. Pieces, he said. Fragments. I remember riding hard, being chased. There was a fire, a church fire. His eyes snapped open, and the anguish she'd seen in his fever dreams flooded back into them. The Porter family. Dear God, the church was burning. What happened to them? Maggie asked, her voice quiet. I failed them, he whispered, the words heavy with a despair that seemed to suck the air from the room. Pastor Porter, his wife Carolyn, their children. Raiders attacked during the evening service. I got there too late. The church was already an inferno. He looked down at his own hands as if seeing them stained with blood. I could hear them screaming inside. But the flames, I couldn't get to them. I couldn't save them. The grief was so palpable, so raw, Maggie almost believed him without question. But she'd lived long enough to know that men often carried stories, and not all of them were true. Is that how you were injured? Trying to save them? He shook his head, a look of confusion returning. No, it was after. I remember riding away from Redemption Springs. I turned in my badge. I couldn't wear it after a failure like that. He frowned, trying to piece the memories together. But then, it gets hazy. Someone following me. Gunshots. Then, nothing. Until I woke up here. He looked up at her, his blue eyes locking onto hers. I'm putting you in danger, Mrs. Holloway. If the person who shot me comes looking for me. This station has seen its share of trouble, Maggie cut in, her voice firm. I'm not as helpless as I look. A small, reluctant smile touched his lips. You're a stubborn woman, Mrs. Holloway. Maggie, she corrected, surprised at her own forwardness. And yes, stubbornness is a virtue out here. She handed him a cup of water, and as he took it, his fingers brushed against hers. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, a stark reminder of how long it had been since she'd felt another person's touch. Thank you, he said quietly, his eyes already closing with exhaustion. For saving my life. Maggie turned away, gathering the old bandages. My father was a minister, she said, her back to him. He taught me the story of the Good Samaritan. Your husband would be proud, Hayes murmured, already drifting back to sleep. Would he? Or would Robert have called her a fool for bringing a broken, hunted lawman into their home, into the path of a danger she couldn't yet see or understand? That night, Maggie knelt by her bed and prayed, Lord, I don't know if this man is a blessing or a curse. Guide me, show me the way. She opened her Bible at random, a habit her father disapproved of, but one that brought her comfort. Her eyes fell on a line from Hebrews, Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. She looked toward the guest room, where the wounded sheriff slept. An angel? Not likely. But maybe the message wasn't about angels at all. Maybe it was about taking a chance on a stranger, even when every instinct told you to be afraid. In the weeks that followed, a strange and quiet routine settled over Holloway Station. Nathan Hayes began to heal. The infection in his shoulder receded, and with each passing day, a little more of his strength returned. He was not a man who took well to idleness. As soon as he could stand without swaying, he insisted on earning his keep. I've imposed on you long enough, he'd said. There are chores to be done. He had a lawman's eye for detail, noticing things Maggie had long since learned to ignore. A loose shutter, a sagging corral fence, a patch on the roof that needed mending. He worked with a quiet, steady competence that reminded her, sometimes painfully, of Robert. They moved around each other with a careful courtesy, two strangers bound by circumstance, sharing a small space at the edge of the world. They rarely spoke of his past, or of hers. The grief they each carried was a silent third party in the house, an invisible presence they both respected. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun bleed across the desert sky. It was in these quiet moments that Maggie felt the crushing weight of her loneliness begin to lift, just a little. You handle that revolver like you know how to use it, Hayes observed one evening. Robert taught me, she replied, but I've never felt comfortable with it. Comfort doesn't matter, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Skill does. Out here, being able to defend yourself is a necessity. Would you let me help you improve? She hesitated. Part of her still held back, unsure if she could fully trust this man in his fractured story. But the pragmatist in her won out. With a baby on the way, she needed to be able to protect them both. The next day, he set up tin cans on the fence and began her lessons. He was a patient teacher, correcting her stance, her grip, showing her how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. Slow and steady, he'd say, his voice calm behind her. Like you're trying not to break an egg. Under his guidance, she found her aim improving, and with it, a small measure of confidence she hadn't felt in months. One afternoon, as they walked back from their practice, he told her about his past, about the guilt that haunted him. Fear is a companion I know well, he said. It's been riding with me ever since that night at the church. Something in his quiet confession unlocked a door inside her. Before this baby, she found herself saying, her hand on her belly, there was another, a daughter, Emily. She came too early, lived only a few hours. The words came out, and the grief she kept so tightly guarded washed over her. That's why I'm so afraid, she admitted, her voice trembling. Not just of being alone. I'm afraid I'll fail again, that I'll lose this one too. You didn't fail, Maggie, he said, using her first name for the first time. His voice was soft, but held a certainty that cut through her fear. Some things are just beyond our control. His simple words of absolution brought tears to her eyes. It was what Robert had said, what she had tried to tell herself, but hearing it from this stranger, this man who understood the weight of failure, made it feel real. That night, as she read from her Bible by lamplight, he joined in, reciting a psalm from memory. My mother made me learn it as a boy, he explained with a slight shrug. Said it would serve me well in times of trouble. It was another piece of the puzzle of Nathan Hayes, a lawman haunted by failure, who knew Scripture by heart. The more she learned, the more complex and contradictory he seemed. He began to take on larger tasks, repairing the leaky roof, reinforcing the corral, and to her surprise, building a cradle for the baby. He carved it from the wood of an old wagon wheel, sanding it smooth until it felt like silk beneath her fingers. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Every child deserves a proper place to sleep," he replied, a shadow of sadness crossing his face. She knew he was thinking of the Porter children, the ones he believed he'd let burn. The gaps in his memory still troubled him. "You said you turned in your badge," she pressed him gently one night, "but you were wearing it when I found you." He frowned, wrestling with the inconsistency. "It doesn't make sense. I remember placing it on the mayor's desk. But there are holes, places where the memories just aren't." He picked up the dented badge. "But someone definitely shot at me, and they hit this instead of my heart. That part is real enough." The implication was chilling. Someone hadn't just wanted him gone. They had wanted him dead. "When the baby comes," he said, his voice low, "I'll leave. My presence here puts you both at risk." "And go where?" she asked, surprised by the pang of loss she felt at the thought. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't stay here and bring my trouble to your doorstep." She reached across the table, her fingers lightly touching his wrist. "Nathan," she said softly, "we all fail. We all fall short. That's why grace exists." He looked at her hand, then up into her eyes, and for a moment, the pain in his expression eased. He was a mystery, a man of contradictions, a danger she had willingly brought into her home. But as she looked at him, she realized with a certainty that frightened her, she was glad he was here. She was glad she hadn't left him in the desert to die. The arrival of Preacher Miller was always an event. He was a circuit rider, a thin, weathered man who served as a lifeline for the scattered homesteads, bringing mail, news, and the word of God to the loneliest corners of the territory. When Maggie saw his familiar wagon approaching from the west, she felt a surge of relief. "Preacher Miller's coming," she called to Hayes, who was on the porch mending a chair. He straightened immediately, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun belt he had started wearing again. The gesture didn't escape her. He was a man expecting trouble. "A blessed day to you, my dear," Miller called, climbing down from his wagon. His faded blue eyes took in her advanced pregnancy, then shifted to Hayes, his expression curious. "This is Nathan Hayes," Maggie explained. "He was injured in the desert. I've been helping him recover." The two men shook hands, Miller's shrewd gaze taking in every detail of the stranger. They moved inside out of the heat, and over coffee, the preacher delivered his news. "There's been talk in Tucson," he began, his tone serious, "about a U.S. Marshal asking questions. A Marshal Sullivan said he's looking for a sheriff from Redemption Springs who abandoned his post." Miller paused, looking directly at Hayes. Described him as dark-haired, blue-eyed, with a bullet wound in his shoulder. Said the man suffered a head injury and might be confused or dangerous. The room went silent. Hayes sat perfectly still, the color draining from his face. "I should go," he said, his voice tight. "If Sullivan is looking for me, I won't put you in danger." "Wait." Miller held up a hand. "There's more. I've been riding these territories for 30 years. I know every federal marshal from here to Kansas City. There is no Marshal Sullivan." An imposter. Someone was hunting Hayes under the guise of the law. But why? "And there's something else," Miller said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded newspaper. He spread it on the table, his finger pointing to a small article at the bottom of the page. Hayes leaned over to read it. Maggie watched his face as his expression shifted from tension to utter, stupefied disbelief. "What is it?" she asked. He looked up, his eyes wide. It says the Porter family is recovering from their injuries. It says Pastor Porter expressed his gratitude to Sheriff Hayes for his heroic rescue of the entire family." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. Rescued, not dead. Hayes read directly from the paper, his voice trembling. Sheriff Hayes risked his own life to enter the burning building, pulling Pastor Porter, his wife Caroline, and their 3 children to safety before the roof collapsed. He set the paper down, his hand shaking. "But I remember, I heard them screaming. I failed them." "The mind can play tricks after a trauma, son," Miller said gently, "especially with a head injury. Sometimes our fears become more real to us than the truth." Hayes was reeling, his entire world tilting on its axis. The guilt that had defined him, that had driven him from his home, was based on a lie, a memory that wasn't real. But if I saved them, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, then why did I leave? And who shot me? That, Miller said grimly, is the question this supposed Marshal Sullivan seems very interested in you not being able to answer. The pieces started to click into place, forming a terrifying picture. Hayes hadn't failed. He was a hero, and someone had tried to kill him, had filled his head with a false memory of failure to make him run, to discredit him, to get him out of the way. But who and why? Preacher Miller is right, Hayes said, his expression hardening with a new resolve. Whoever this Sullivan is, he's coming. I have to leave. I'll go with you at first light. Maggie's heart sank. After all this, after everything they had been through, he was going to leave. And go where? She challenged, her voice sharper than she intended. Injured, with no horse, no supplies? That's not a plan, Nathan. It's suicide. She hated the pleading note in her voice, but she couldn't stop it. The thought of facing the coming birth alone, of him disappearing back into the desert, was more than she could bear. The baby is due in less than a month. What if something goes wrong, like with Emily? He crossed the room to stand before her. I don't want to leave, Maggie, he admitted, his voice low, but I care about you and your child too much to risk your safety. The simple, honest words hung in the air between them. Tears pricked her eyes. Then stay, she whispered, just until the baby comes. Please. He looked at her, a long, searching look, the conflict warring in his eyes. Finally, he gave a single sharp nod. Until the baby comes, he agreed. But at the first sign of trouble, I'm gone. No arguments. Relief washed over her, so powerful she felt weak. That night a storm rolled in, a monster of a storm that rattled the very bones of the cabin. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, a sharp pain shot through Maggie's abdomen, stealing her breath. It wasn't a practice contraction. This was real. The baby was coming, weeks early, in the middle of a raging storm, with a fake U.S. Marshal hunting the man by her side. The storm outside was a symphony of chaos, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing. Nathan, Maggie gasped, clutching the porch railing as another contraction ripped through her. The baby! It's coming now! Panic flashed in Hayes's eyes, quickly replaced by a steely calm. He and Preacher Miller sprang into action, their movements swift and purposeful. They helped her inside, their faces grim in the flickering lamplight. There was no doctor, no midwife, just a weary preacher who'd attended a handful of births and a wounded lawman who looked as terrified as she felt. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and prayer. The storm howled, the wind shrieked, and Maggie's world narrowed to the rhythm of her own body, a relentless cycle of agony and release. Miller was a calm presence, his voice a steady anchor in the tempest, but it was Hayes who surprised her. My sister, he explained during a brief lull, his voice tight. I helped deliver her youngest when a blizzard hit. I'm not completely useless. He was more than not useless. He was her rock. He held her hand, wiped the sweat from her brow, and spoke to her in low, encouraging tones, his strength flowing into her when she felt her own was failing. As dawn approached and the storm began to break, her labor reached its final, desperate peak. The pain was all-consuming, an impossible, tearing agony. One more push, Maggie, Hayes urged, his voice in her ear. You can do this. You're the strongest woman I've ever known. She gathered every last ounce of her strength and bore down, a final, guttural scream tearing from her throat. And then, a sudden, blessed release. It was followed by the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, the angry, indignant cry of a newborn baby taking its first breath. It's a boy, Miller announced, his voice thick with emotion. A strong, healthy boy. Tears of joy and exhaustion streamed down Maggie's face as the preacher laid the tiny, squirming infant on her chest. He was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes. He was here. He was alive. Hello, Thomas, she whispered, giving him the name she and Robert had chosen. Through her blurred vision, she looked up at Hayes. He was watching them, his face unguarded, stripped of all its pain and confusion. What she saw there, a profound wonder, a fierce tenderness, brought a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she said, the words hopelessly inadequate. He just shook his head, a single tear tracing a path down his own weathered cheek. "No," he said softly. "Thank you." In the quiet aftermath of the storm, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. Little Thomas Robert Holloway had arrived, a tiny miracle born into a world of danger. But they weren't safe yet. The man calling himself Sullivan was still out there, and he was hunting. A week passed in a dreamlike haze of new motherhood. The world shrank to the size of the small cabin, to the rhythm of feeding and changing and holding little Thomas. Hayes and Miller took care of everything else, a silent, watchful guard over the new mother and child. Miller, the preacher, delayed his departure. He said it was out of concern, but Maggie knew he was worried about leaving her alone with Hayes, a man still shrouded in mystery. The mystery only deepened when Miller took a closer look at the newspaper article. "There's something I missed," he told Maggie one morning, his face grave. He pointed to a line at the end of the article. Pastor Porter expressed profound gratitude for Sheriff Hayes' heroism, especially in light of Deputy Marshal Sullivan's concerning report about the sheriff's mental state following his head injury. Maggie's blood ran cold. "Sullivan is mentioned here," she said, her voice a whisper. "He's not an imposter. He's connected to Redemption Springs. If Sullivan was a real lawman, then his hunt for Hayes wasn't a rogue operation. It was official, which meant Hayes wasn't just a victim. He was a fugitive. When they showed Hayes, he was adamant. 'That's not possible. Sullivan wasn't my deputy. A man named Jacob Reynolds was. I've known him for 15 years. The contradictions were maddening. A newspaper article that called him a hero, a supposed deputy he'd never heard of, hunting him as a dangerous lunatic, a memory of failure that felt more real than the truth. What was real? Who could they trust? They decided Miller had to go to Tucson and send a telegraph directly to Redemption Springs to get the truth once and for all. It was a 3-day ride, 3 days of waiting, of not knowing if the man in her house was a hero or a madman. After the preacher left, a tense quiet settled between them. The station felt smaller, more isolated than ever. "He warned you about me, didn't he?" Hayes said that evening, his voice quiet. "Miller, he told you to be careful." Maggie didn't deny it. "And he was right," Hayes continued, the self-doubt clear in his voice. "How can you trust me to protect you when I don't even know what's real anymore?" She looked at him then, at the conflict and pain in his eyes, and in that moment she made a choice. "Because I've seen your heart, Nathan," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Whatever else is confused in your mind, that part of you is true. I am staking my life, and my son's life, on it." His expression softened, the raw honesty of her faith in him seeming to steady him. He had been a stranger, a danger, a puzzle. But he had also delivered her son. He had shown her a kindness and a strength she thought had died with Robert. But her faith was about to be tested. Because 5 days later, as Hayes was repairing the pump at the well, he saw it. A dust cloud on the horizon. Not one rider. At least 5. And they were riding hard, heading straight for the station. The hunter had found them. "Riders coming! At least 5 of them!" Hayes's voice was a low, urgent warning that sent a jolt of pure ice through Maggie's veins. She snatched Thomas from his basket, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Get inside," Hayes commanded, grabbing his rifle from the porch. "The hiding place, now." It was a small, concealed cellar Robert had built beneath the kitchen floor, a place for valuables, now a refuge for her and her son. "The signal," Hayes said, his eyes boring into hers. 3 short knocks, then 2 long. "Don't come out for anyone else, no matter what you hear." "Be careful," she whispered, her hand briefly touching his arm. He covered her hand with his. "I will do whatever it takes to keep you both safe." She slipped into the darkness of the cellar, clutching Thomas to her chest. Hayes slid the floorboards back into place, and she was plunged into a world of blackness and silence. broken only by the sound of her own frantic breathing and the thumping of her heart. Above her, she heard the thunder of hoofbeats arriving in the yard. Then a man's voice, smooth and authoritative. "Hello, the house. I'm Deputy Marshal Sullivan. I'm looking for Sheriff Nathan Hayes. I mean him no harm. He's suffered a head injury. He's confused and needs medical attention." The story was so reasonable, so convincing. If she didn't know better, she would have believed it herself. This Sullivan was clever. He was dangerous. Then from his position at the window, Hayes saw the man's face, and the final terrible piece of the puzzle clicked into place. He moved silently to the back of the house, slipping out into the yard while the man at the front continued to call out. He circled around, taking out a lone lookout with a single, silent blow. Then from a ridge behind the station, he fired a shot into the air. It was a desperate gamble, a ruse to draw them away. "There, on the ridge!" she heard a man shout from above. "Hayes, is that you?" Sullivan's voice called out. "We're here to help." Another shot rang out, and then the sound of horses galloping away in pursuit. Maggie held her breath, praying it had worked, praying Nathan had gotten away. The hours that followed were the longest of her life. She sat in the dark, cramped space, listening to every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, imagining the worst. Thomas, mercifully, slept in her arms, a small, warm weight of innocence in a world that had suddenly become terrifying. What if they came back? What if Nathan didn't? Late in the afternoon, when she had almost given up hope, she heard it, the soft, rhythmic tapping on the floor above her. 3 short knocks, then 2 long ones. The floorboards slid open, and Nathan's face appeared in the rectangle of light. He was dusty and exhausted, but he was alive. "They're gone," he said, helping her out of the cellar. "But we have a bigger problem." "What is it?" she asked, her eyes scanning him for injuries. He looked at her, his face grim. "It wasn't Sullivan. I mean, it was the man calling himself Sullivan. But I know him." He took a deep breath. "It was Jacob Reynolds, my deputy." The betrayal was staggering. Not a stranger, not a phantom lawman, but his own second in command. The man he had trusted for 15 years. "He's the one," Maggie whispered, the implications crashing down on her. "He's the one who shot you, who tried to make you think you were a failure." "Yes," Hayes said, "and if he's gone to this much trouble, it means he's not going to give up. He'll be back." They were trapped, alone, with a newborn baby, hunted by a corrupt lawman and his hired guns. Their only hope was Preacher Miller and his telegraph message, a message that was still days away. As darkness fell, they prepared for a siege. They barricaded the doors, checked their weapons, and planned their defense. There would be no more running. This was their home. They would make their stand here. "Next time," Maggie said, her voice fierce with a resolve that surprised them both. "We decide together. This isn't just your fight anymore, Nathan. It's ours." The next day passed in a tense, watchful silence. Every shadow, every sound, seemed to hold a threat. Then just as dusk began to settle, Hayes saw them. "They're coming," he said, his voice low. "From the north this time, 3 riders." It was fewer than before, but that didn't make it any less deadly. Maggie moved Thomas to the hiding place, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Hayes took his position at the window, rifle at the ready. Reynolds rode forward alone, stopping just out of range. "Hello, the house," he called again. "I know you're in there, Hayes, and I know about the woman and child. For their sake, come out now." The veiled threat made Hayes's blood run cold. "Step into the light, Jacob," Hayes shouted back. "Let me see the face of a traitor." Reynolds moved into the lantern light, his face a mask of false concern. "You're confused, Sheriff. Delusional. The doctor warned us this might happen." "Did he also warn you I might remember who really set fire to that church?" Hayes bluffed, firing a shot in the dark. The barb hit its mark. Reynolds's composure cracked. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he snarled, his hand dropping to his gun. "Last chance, Hayes. Come out, or Mrs. Holloway becomes a widow twice over." He gestured to his men, and they began to advance. This was it, the final stand. But just as Reynolds raised his pistol, another sound cut through the tense silence. The sound of a single rider approaching fast from the west. All heads turned. A lone figure galloped out of the twilight. It was Preacher Miller, his mule moving with an urgency Maggie had never seen before. He reined in at the edge of the yard, taking in the scene. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but carrying an iron authority. "This doesn't concern you, Preacher," Reynolds snapped. "Move along." "Actually," Miller said, dismounting and reaching into his coat, "I believe it does." He held up a piece of paper. "Especially since I've just come from Tucson, with a telegraph from the real U.S. Marshal's office." The words landed like a thunderclap. "They confirmed a few things for me," Miller continued, advancing slowly. "First, there is no Marshal Sullivan. Second, Sheriff Hayes is a hero. And third, they were very interested to hear about a deputy named Jacob Reynolds impersonating a federal officer, setting fires, and attempting to murder his own sheriff." Reynolds's face twisted in a mask of fury. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, old man." "Then enlighten us, Jacob," Hayes called out. "What was worth all this?" "Progress," Reynolds spat, his eyes wild. "The railroad is coming through Redemption Springs. There are millions to be made. Pastor Porter and his homesteaders were standing in the way." He had to be silenced. The confession hung in the air, ugly and raw. It was all about money, greed. "I'm not going to prison," Reynolds sneered, raising his gun, his eyes locking on Hayes. But before he could fire, a shot rang out from an unexpected direction. It came from one of Reynolds' own men. "That's enough, Reynolds," the man shouted, his gun now trained on his boss. "I signed on to bring in a lawman, not to be part of a murder." The betrayal was too much for Reynolds. With a roar of rage, he swung his gun toward his own man. Two shots cracked the night, almost as one. Hayes' rifle and the hired gun's pistol. Reynolds staggered back, two dark stains blossoming on his chest. He looked down in disbelief, his revolver slipping from his fingers. He collapsed into the dust, and the long, terrible siege of Holloway Station was finally over. In the quiet aftermath, the truth spilled out. Davidson, the hired gun who had turned on Reynolds, confirmed everything. They had been hired under false pretenses, told they were retrieving an unstable lawman for his own safety. They were mercenaries, not murderers. Reynolds, clinging to life by a thread, was tied to his saddle. Davidson and his men agreed to take him to the authorities in Tucson, along with a full written statement from Hayes, witnessed by the preacher. As they prepared to leave, Hayes turned to Maggie. The danger had passed, but a new, unspoken tension hung between them. "I have to go back, Maggie," he said, his voice heavy. "This corruption in Redemption Springs, it runs deep. I have to see it through." She knew he was right. It was who he was. "I know," she said, her own voice quiet. He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "When it's finished, may I come back? Not as a stranger or a protector, but as a man who wants to build a life. With you, with Thomas." The question she had been too afraid to even ask herself hung in the air. "Nathan Hayes," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "I would be sorely disappointed if you didn't." The farewell on the porch the next morning was brief. They were not people for grand, emotional displays. There was a simple embrace, a quiet promise in his eyes, and then he was gone, riding north toward the life he had to finish before he could start a new one. The weeks that followed were filled with a new kind of waiting, not the waiting of a grieving widow, but the waiting of a woman with a future. Miller brought news when he could. The railroad conspiracy was being unraveled. Reynolds, having survived, had confessed everything to save his own skin. Then one clear autumn morning, nearly 2 months after he'd left, she saw him, a lone rider on the northern horizon. He dismounted at the edge of the yard and walked toward her, his eyes taking in the sight of her and little Thomas, who was now cooing in his basket. "You're late," she said, the gentle tease covering a world of relief. "It took longer than expected," he replied, his gaze never leaving her face. "But my part is finished." The words settled between them. His old life was over. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. Everything that matters to me is right here. He knelt by Thomas's basket, then stood and took a small leather pouch from his pocket. Inside was a simple silver ring. I'm not Robert, he said, his voice rough. I can't replace what you lost, but I can offer you a different future, if you'll have me. She looked from the ring to the man holding it, this impossible gift the desert had sent her. A man who had walked through fire and betrayal and come out the other side, not broken, but whole. I don't want you to replace Robert, she said gently, extending her hand. The future belongs to us, if we choose to claim it. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Then welcome home, Nathan, she whispered. He had come to her as a wounded stranger, a man without a memory, haunted by a failure that wasn't his. She had taken him in, healed him, and in doing so, had healed a part of herself she thought was lost forever. Together with their son, they had faced down the ghosts of the past and the dangers of the present. The desert was a harsh and unforgiving place. It took and it took. But sometimes, in the most unlikely of ways, it also gave back. It had taken her husband, but it had given her a new family. It had given her grace in a barren land, a second chance, a home. If you enjoyed this story of survival and second chances in the Old West, do the like and subscribe thing, and maybe hit that notification bell, because you never know what other strange tales the desert might be waiting to tell.